Welcome back, everyone, to criminal law and to the start of our next module of the semester. In this module, we're going to focus on the general inchoate crime of attempt. Wait, general inchoate what? Yeah, I know, the topic sounds kind of jargony, but don't worry, what we're about to learn is actually pretty cool. Inchoate is just a fancy word for unrealized. So general inchoate crimes are all about how society deals with people who intend to commit crimes that never come to fruition. In this sense, general inchoate crimes are different than the offenses we've already countered this semester. Think, for example, about destruction of property, or statutory rape, or homicide. These offenses cover very different kinds of criminal behavior, but they all share something important in common. They require social harm to be realized. You can't be convicted of property destruction unless the government can prove you actually destroyed property. And you can't be convicted of homicide unless the government can prove you actually killed someone. But what if you plan to commit one of these crimes, but were unsuccessful in achieving your criminal objective? Maybe you intended to shoot your criminal law professor in class, but your gun jammed at the last moment. Or maybe the police got wind of your plot from one of your other classmates and arrested you right before our class started. You can't be convicted for murder if you weren't able to kill me. But just because your bad intent was never realized, well, that doesn't make you blameless. After all, the only difference between your failed effort and a more successful one was probably sheer luck. You didn't choose for your gun to jam, you only chose to pull the trigger. And when you did, you were hoping for my immediate death. So from a retributive perspective, your choice was just as culpable as the choice of a successful murderer. What about from a public safety perspective? Well, for one thing, someone who fails to realize their criminal intentions on one occasion might try again on another. And that makes them dangerous to society. Society also has an interest in letting other dangerous people know that merely trying to do harm is enough to land you in prison. And when deterrence fails, it's important for law enforcement to be able to stop serious crimes before they happen, without having to worry that the people they arrest will walk away scot-free. So in the real world, most people who intend to commit crimes but fall short won't walk away scot-free. Instead, they'll face very serious consequences for their unrealized efforts to perpetrate criminal offenses. But that's only made possible by general inchoate crimes. These are crimes which, as Professor Laurie Levenson phrases it, provide society with a safety barrier that punishes those who are intent on committing criminal offenses. This week, we're going to be focusing on one part, and arguably the most important part, of that safety barrier, the general inchoate crime of attempt. Simply put, an attempt involves trying to cause harm. Under U.S. criminal law, trying to commit a crime is itself a crime, which is prohibited and punished by general attempt provisions contained in every U.S. criminal code. Some of these general provisions have a lot to say about the elements of attempt liability. Others say very little, in which case it becomes the responsibility of courts to clarify the government's burden of proof in attempt prosecutions. But whether the elements of attempt are set forth by statute or in reported judicial decisions, the major policy issues in this area remain the same. This week, we're going to focus on three policy issues. First, what is the mens rea, or culpable state of mind, that must be proven to convict someone of a criminal attempt? Is it enough for an attempter to act with the culpable mental states required by the underlying offense? Or are there some situations, for example, attempts to commit crimes that can be established by proof of recklessness or negligence, where a higher mens rea must be proven? Second, what's the actus reus, or conduct requirement, of an attempt? Clearly, someone who does everything necessary to commit an offense, but fails to complete their criminal objective due to some fortuity outside their control, like a gun that jams at the last moment, well, they've done enough to support attempt liability. But what about the situation of someone whose criminal plans are frustrated by police earlier in the timeline? At what point can we say that someone crossed over the line from tentative preparation to hard and fast criminal perpetration? Third and finally, when people cross that line, how should we sentence them? For example, should the fact that the social harm prohibited by an offense never occurred matter to punishment, even if the defendant's culpable intent was the same? And if we say that, yeah, social harm matters and that attempts should be sentenced less severely, then what's the right discount? 25% off punishment for the completed offense? Maybe 50% off? Or even more? These are the fascinating and important questions we're going to be wrestling with this week. Now, I want to tell you about our plan of attack. In this recording, we're going to pursue two main objectives. First, I'm going to provide you with a more detailed overview of general inchoate crimes. This is intended as background for our study of criminal attempts. Then, once we have a better sense of what general inchoate liability is, we're going to spend the rest of this recording focusing on one particularly thorny aspect of attempt liability, and that's mens rea. The mens rea of attempt is a challenging topic, which I think is best covered slowly in a lecture format. So that's what we'll be doing here, focusing on the modern, element analysis-based approach. Once you've completed the recording, you should then turn to the reading and class assignments on this topic, as well as the other topics in attempt liability we'll be discussing in this week's class. Does that sound good to you? I hope so. So with that, let's dive in. Okay, so again, our focus in this module is on general inchoate crimes. Inchoate is a fancy piece of legal jargon which means not fully done or unrealized. So inchoate crimes punish efforts towards achieving some criminal objective without requiring proof that the criminal objective has actually occurred. In this sense, inchoate crimes are different than the completed or coate offenses that we've considered this semester. To secure conviction for destruction of property or homicide, the prohibited social harm actually needs to be proven. But for inchoate crimes, the government only needs to prove an intent to achieve a criminal objective and particular kinds of efforts made towards achieving it. So there are three primary kinds of efforts that the criminal law prohibits, and those are reflected in the big three general inchoate crimes: attempts, solicitations, and criminal conspiracies. Simply put, a criminal attempt involves trying to commit an offense. A criminal solicitation involves asking another person to commit an offense. And a criminal conspiracy involves agreeing to commit an offense. Each of these inchoate crimes are general in the sense that they apply broadly across specific offenses, but they don't constitute independent offenses in their own right. So for example, we don't convict people of criminal attempt full stop. Instead, we convict people for attempting to commit some other crime. And the same goes for general inchoate crimes of conspiracy and solicitation. Throughout our discussion, I'm going to refer to the object of a general inchoate crime as the, quote, target offense. So for example, if someone is charged with attempted murder, then murder constitutes a target offense. And if someone's charged with attempted statutory rape, well then statutory rape constitutes a target offense. In this class, we're going to focus on the general inchoate crime of attempt. But even still, I want you to have a general sense of how all three of the major general inchoate crimes relate to one another. And to do that, it's helpful to think in terms of the timeline for criminal activity. So most uninterrupted crimes begin with an initial idea and then end when someone does everything they plan to do to complete it. Between these two bookends, there's a lot of room for intermediate steps on the timeline. I'm talking about things like evaluation, deliberation, recruiting others, preparing, and execution. As we've discussed throughout this semester, a voluntary act is a fundamental requirement of criminal liability. So no inchoate crime begins at the initial moment of conception. Mere thoughts are not enough. Instead, some tangible progress on the criminal timeline is necessary. In many situations, the earliest point in which general inchoate liability arises is with a solicitation, which again involves requesting another person to commit a crime. Broadly speaking, the moment one person asks another person to commit a crime, the requesting party can be convicted for soliciting the target offense. Nothing more needs to happen or be proven. In this sense, solicitation is typically the broadest form of general inchoate liability. Slightly narrower, though still very broad, is a general inchoate crime of conspiracy, which again involves agreeing to commit an offense. Generally speaking, a criminal conspiracy has occurred when two or more parties agree to commit an offense, and then at least one of the parties engages in some overt act in furtherance of their agreement. Because of the requirements of both agreement and an overt act, criminal conspiracies are generally the second inchoate crime to arise on the criminal timeline. The third and final general inchoate crime to arise on the timeline is usually a criminal attempt. Because criminal attempts involve trying to commit an offense, they often require proof of conduct that comes the closest to completion of the offense, particularly where someone is trying to commit a crime on their own, as opposed to with the help of others. Let's illustrate these principles with a story. That story centers around Dahlia, who is a hardworking attorney with a terrible, sexist, and abusive boss named Vince. After a few very difficult years of working for Vince, Dahlia wakes up one day and decides she'd like to rid the world of him. So she pours herself a nutritious bowl of Lucky Charms cereal and begins thinking about how to get this done. The simplest solution, she decides, is to hire Harriet the Hitwoman, who has an excellent reputation for executing abusive men. So Dahlia calls up Harriet and offers her $1,000 to do the job. As soon as Dahlia's verbal offer has left her mouth, she's committed a criminal solicitation. Specifically, she solicited murder. And that's so, although moments later, Harriet tells Dahlia that she'd love to accept the offer, but she can't, because she's just retired from the assassination game. So that's disappointing, but there's also good news. Lucky for Dahlia, assassination runs in Harriet's family. So Harriet refers Dahlia to her younger sister, Ruth, who's also a hitwoman. After speaking with Ruth, Dahlia is impressed, so she offers her the job, which Ruth promptly accepts. Soon thereafter, Ruth begins to engage in some basic preparations to carry out the job. At this point, Dahlia and Ruth have both conspired to murder Vince. And that's so, although soon after Ruth's preparations begins, she dies of a heart attack and is unable to carry out the job. Argle bargle. Now Dahlia's really frustrated. Like, how hard can it be to find a good hitwoman these days? Apparently, if you want something done, then you need to do it yourself. Or at least that's what Dahlia says to herself. So that's what she tries to do. After making detailed plans to assassinate her boss, Dahlia buys guns and ammo specifically for the job. In some jurisdictions, as you'll soon read about, this substantial step towards the perpetration of a crime could alone provide the basis for convicting Dahlia of attempted murder. But in other jurisdictions, it would be necessary for Dahlia to progress even further down the criminal timeline. Say, for example, by actually arriving to the scene of her planned assassination with gun in hand and Vince in sight. Setting these policy differences aside, though, all jurisdictions would say that once Dahlia's carried out every part of her plan, say by walking up to Vince, pointing her gun, and then pulling the trigger, well, then she'd definitely be liable for an attempt. Okay, so those are the primary differences between the big three general inchoate crimes. Now I want to flag an important similarity, and that's mens rea. To be guilty of any inchoate offense, the defendant must have a very guilty mind. And that makes sense, because in an area of law that doesn't require social harm, the guilty mind is the most culpable thing that general inchoate crimes have to work with. In many cases, the conduct involved in a general inchoate prosecution can be entirely innocuous. So criminal liability lives or dies based on what was happening in the mind of the defendant. That's one reason why the common law described attempt, conspiracy, and solicitation as specific intent crimes, even when the target of a general inchoate crime may have only been categorized as one of general intent. Of course, these general and specific intent labels don't tell you much about what mens rea actually needs to be proven, since they fail to provide the kind of elemental analysis necessary to clarify the government's burden of proof. But these vague common law labels do at least clearly communicate a basic idea. To be convicted of a general inchoate crime, the actor must possess a state of mind which is at least as culpable as what's required by the target offense. And sometimes, as we'll soon learn, the mens rea of a general inchoate crime might be even more demanding yet. In the rest of this recording, we're going to explore this idea as it applies to the general inchoate crime of attempt, focusing on the modern elemental perspective on mens rea we've been studying throughout the semester. But before we dive into the mens rea of attempts, I do want to acknowledge something important. This is a pretty challenging topic. Assessing the mens rea that must be proven for a completed offense is already pretty hard. So adding an additional layer of general inchoate liability on top can pose an even greater challenge. But if you keep everything we've learned about element analysis this semester in mind, I'm confident you'll be able to surmount that challenge. And as always, be compassionate with yourself. Everyone learns at their own pace. And know that I'm here to guide you each step of the way. Okay, so there are three main mens rea principles we're going to be focusing on this recording. First, attempt liability requires the purpose to engage in conduct constituting the target offense. Second, attempt liability incorporates the culpable mental state requirements governing the target offense. And third, when the target offense of an attempt incorporates a result element, then attempt liability requires proof of an intent to cause a result. And that's true even if a lesser culpable mental state like recklessness or negligence is sufficient to satisfy the target offense. Okay, so those are the three mens rea principles we're going to be covering. Now let's consider each in greater detail. So the foundation for criminal attempt liability is a special kind of purpose, the purpose to engage in the conduct constituting an offense. Specifically, to attempt to commit an offense is to act with a purpose to engage in a course of conduct satisfying the objective elements of an offense. To illustrate, consider the situation of Dylan, who the police arrest in a bank parking lot sitting within his car with a firearm, a ski mask, and a paper entitled, quote, bank robbery plan. Based on these findings, the government wants to prosecute Dylan for attempted bank robbery. What do you think they have to prove? Well, one thing, and arguably the most fundamental thing, that the government would have to prove is that it was Dylan's purpose, at the moment he was arrested in his car, to engage in conduct constituting a bank robbery, however that offense is defined by law. If you take a moment to reflect on Dylan's situation, you'll come to see that this special purpose requirement is more or less a logical necessity. If attempt means anything, it's that someone planned to do the thing they're being charged with trying to do, and which the criminal law told them they can't do. Indeed, how could it be otherwise? Imagine, for example, that after Dylan's arrest, the police learned that Dylan was an off-Broadway actor who was on his way to rehearsal for a play about bank robberies that he was a lead role in. In that case, the government would have no basis for convicting Dylan of attempted bank robbery because he wasn't actually planning to commit a bank robbery, only to act in a play about them. One thing to note about this special purpose requirement is that it's really only material in prosecutions involving incomplete attempts, which is to say, in situations where the attempter hasn't been able to carry out every step of their criminal plan. So, for example, when someone like Dylan is arrested outside a bank with a weapon, then it needs to be proven that they plan to do more than they did. But that's not the case in the situation of a completed attempt, which is where someone did everything necessary to commit a crime, but were unsuccessful for some extraneous reason. Say, for example, because their gun jammed or the victim ducked at the last moment. Under these circumstances, the defendant already did everything they needed to do to complete an offense, so there's no need to prove that they plan to do more. With that in mind, there's one final thing I'd like to note about the special purpose requirement. The government does not need to prove that the defendant's plans, had he or she been able to carry them out, would have actually been successful, all things considered. It's enough that the defendant's purpose was to engage in conduct which would have been successful had the situation been as the defendant believed it to be. This simple idea does away with one of the most confusing areas of the common law, which we won't be focusing on this semester, the difference between factual and legal impossibility. And it also explains how sting operations and many other situations where it would have been impossible for a crime to actually be committed can still result in attempt liability. To illustrate what I'm talking about, I want you to imagine an adult male who meets an undercover police agent online. This police agent is posing as a 10th grade teenager in a chat room where adults seeking sexual relationships with minors are known to visit. So this unsuspecting adult male and the police agent, who the adult male mistakenly believes to be a minor, make plans to meet up at a public park in the middle of the night to engage in sexual intercourse. Once the adult male arrives at the park and is sitting in his car, however, he's arrested by police and then charged with attempting to commit statutory rape, which in this jurisdiction prohibits, quote, purposely engaging in sexual contact with someone who is in fact a minor. Assume the requisite conduct requirement for attempt has been met on these facts. Now ask yourself, what does the purpose requirement we've been discussing require the government to prove? And can it be proven based on the facts you've been presented with? If you can, pause the recording for a moment to reflect. Okay, welcome back. So to secure conviction, the government must prove that the defendant's purpose was to engage in conduct that would have resulted in sexual contact with a minor had the situation been as the defendant believed it to be. Can that requirement be met here? The answer is yes. Under the circumstances you've been presented with, it definitely can. After all, the defendant's purpose, which is to say his conscious object, was to engage in sexual intercourse. And that's a kind of sexual contact. Moreover, that sexual contact was planned to occur with a minor. No doubt the police agent wasn't actually a minor, but for purposes of attempt liability, that doesn't matter. It's enough that the defendant believed the victim was a minor, and so the defendant would have committed statutory rape had the situation been as the defendant believed it to be. Does that make sense? I hope so. Okay, so that's the first mens rea principle for attempt liability. Now let's turn to the second. And that's this. Attempt liability incorporates the culpable mental state requirements governing the target offense. This means that to secure a conviction for attempting to commit a crime, the government has to prove that the defendant acted with a state of mind which is at least as culpable as the mens rea governing the target offense. The basic idea behind this principle is straightforward. Because attempt liability piggybacks off of the target offense, and since mens rea plays such an important role in criminal attempts more generally, attempt liability can't be justified when the actor's state of mind is less culpable than what would otherwise be required for the target offense. Okay, so that's the principle. Now let's consider how this principle operates in practice. To illustrate, I want you to consider a statute that prohibits, quote, purposely causing the death of a police officer. Now ask yourself, what does the government have to prove to establish a conviction for this completed offense? Well, the first thing the government has to prove is that the defendant actually caused the death of a police officer. That's actus reus. Now let's talk about mens rea. An elemental analysis of this statute reveals two things about the defendant's mind that have to be proven under the Model Penal Code's definition of purpose. First, that it was the defendant's conscious object to cause death. And second, that the defendant was aware, believed, or hoped that the victim was a police officer. Okay, so that's the mens rea for the completed offense. But what about where an attempt to murder a police officer is charged? Consider, for example, a situation in which Dante, the defendant, was about to pull out a firearm and shoot at one undercover police officer, let's call him Victor, only to be tackled and then arrested by another undercover police officer. Let's call her Vilma. After being arrested by Officer Vilma, Dante, the defendant, admits to having planned to kill Victor. But he says, truthfully, that he was completely unaware that Victor was a police officer. Instead, Dante honestly thought that Victor was the member of a rival gang who had killed Dante's brother a few days ago. If Dante is prosecuted for attempting to murder a police officer on these facts, what mens rea elements does the government have to prove? Well, one thing the government would have to prove is attempt's special purpose requirement, namely that Dante's purpose, at the moment he was tackled by Vilma, was to engage in conduct that would have resulted in the death of a police officer. This special purpose requirement is easily satisfied here based on the facts you've been presented with. Because Dante planned to shoot Victor, who is a police officer, Dante clearly acted with the purpose to engage in conduct which would have resulted in the death of a police officer. Now let's turn to the second mens rea principle, which requires the government to prove that Dante satisfied the culpable mental state requirements governing the target offense. As we've already discussed, for the target offense, it must be proven that the defendant's conscious object was to cause death, and that the defendant was aware, believed, or hoped that the victim was a police officer. So that's also what has to be proven for an attempt to murder a police officer. So, can that be proven here? No, it can't. At least not on the facts you've been presented with. Clearly, Dante acted with the requisite purpose to kill Victor, but in so doing, Dante had no idea that Victor was a police officer. And so therefore, Dante lacked the required mens rea as to the circumstance element of the completed offense. Lacking that culpable mental state, Dante can't be convicted of attempting to do the same. Okay, so this illustrates the second mens rea principle we've been discussing, namely that the defendant's state of mind must satisfy the culpable mental state requirements governing the target offense. But this raises a question. Is satisfying the culpable mental state requirements governing the target offense always enough? Or are there circumstances in which some higher mens rea must be proven? And why, oh why, Professor Sirota, would someone even care to ask this question? Now that's a good question. Let me try to tell you why. In plain English, to attempt to do something is to try to do something. And trying seems to imply something intentional. That is, purposely trying to achieve something, if not being aware that you're likely to achieve it. And yet, as we've seen throughout the semester, many crimes allow criminal liability to rest on something less than intent. For many crimes, it's enough to act recklessly. And for some crimes, proof of negligence will also suffice. And indeed, strict liability, which is to say the absence of any culpable mental state, is also a possibility. Once you consider that reality in light of the seemingly intentional nature of an attempt, something like a Zen koan or riddle presents itself. Can an unintentional offense be unintentionally attempted? Or is there some reason, rooted in either logic or public policy, why there should be no such thing as a reckless, negligent, or strict liability attempt? Okay, so that's the question. Now I'm going to do my best to answer it for you in 4 steps. First, I'm going to provide you with the general rule, which is the third mens rea principle we're going to be learning. Second, I'm going to illustrate what this principle means and how it operates. Third, I'm going to discuss a justification for this principle. And then fourth and finally, I'm going to explain one important implication of this principle. So let's start with a statement of the principle, and that's this. When the target of an attempt incorporates a result element, then attempt liability requires proof of an intent to cause that result. And that's true even if the result element of the target offense is subject to a lower mens rea, whether recklessness, negligence, or in the case of strict liability, none at all. This principle effectively precludes liability for attempted reckless manslaughter, attempted negligent homicide, or attempted strict liability felony murder. Now, the government's always free to charge an attempt to commit one of these or any other non-intentional result element crimes. But, and this is important, to secure an attempt conviction, it would have to be proven that the defendant intended to cause the result element required by the target offense, even though a lesser mental state would suffice for a conviction for the completed offense. Okay, so that's the general principle. Now let's try to figure out what this actually means in practice. To illustrate, consider the following fact pattern. David is a huge LMU women's basketball fan who's running late to the big game. So David jumps in his car and maniacally speeds through a red light when a pedestrian named Vicky begins entering the crosswalk. David was aware that Vicky was walking into the crosswalk, but he thought that he could speed by without making an impact. As a result, David consciously disregards a substantial risk of causing Vicky's death. So if David does make fatal impact with Vicky, he could be charged with and convicted of reckless manslaughter. But what if he doesn't make impact? What if, for example, Vicky jumps out of the way and avoids contact with David's car? In this scenario, David's mental state is the same. He consciously disregarded a substantial risk of death. But because that didn't occur, he can't be convicted of reckless manslaughter. Now, the government could try to charge David with attempted reckless manslaughter. But in that case, under the third mens rea principle we've been discussing, proof of recklessness, which is to say that David consciously disregarded a substantial risk of death, wouldn't be enough. Instead, the government would have to prove that David intended to kill Vicky, and that the government could not do on the facts I presented you with. But this raises a question. What exactly does proof of an intent to cause a result element of the targeted offense entail? So, for example, could someone like David be convicted of knowingly attempting to commit homicide based on their practically certain belief that death would result? Or is a conscious desire to cause harm, which is to say a criminal purpose, the only mental state which will support attempt liability for a result element crime? It probably won't surprise you to hear that the answer is, it depends. Some jurisdictions apply a purpose rule. Under this approach, it must have been the defendant's conscious object to cause any result element required by the target offense to support liability for an attempt. By contrast, other jurisdictions, drawing on the recommendations of the Model Penal Code, apply a slightly less restrictive approach. Under this knowledge rule, proof of a practically certain belief that harm would occur will also support attempt liability. The difference between these two approaches is reflected in the following fact pattern involving Derek. Derek loves animals, and he hates factories that kill them. So he plants a bomb in a local meat processing facility. Derek doesn't want to harm anyone. He just wants to blow up the facility. But there's a problem. The facility has a night watchwoman, Val, who's there all night. Derek would strongly prefer to harm Val, but he has no choice if he wants to decimate the facility. So he sets a detonator on a bomb, practically certain that Val will die in the blast. But as it turns out, the detonator is broken, and so the bomb doesn't go off. Derek is then later arrested and charged with attempted murder. In a jurisdiction that applies a purpose rule, Derek couldn't be convicted of attempted murder since his conscious object was to destroy property, not to kill a human being, as is required by murder. By contrast, in a jurisdiction that applies a knowledge rule, Derek could be convicted of attempted murder based on his practically certain belief that Val would die. Okay, so we've now discussed the third mens rea principle and explored how it applies. Next, let's consider its justification. What do you think explains the criminal law's prohibition on recklessness, negligence, or strict liability as to result elements as the basis for attempt liability? If you can, take a moment to reflect and see what you can come up with. Okay, welcome back. So there are two main reasons offered in support of this principle. One is linguistic. Some people argue that the idea of recklessly or negligently attempting to cause a result is a contradiction in terms, given the plain meaning of attempt. How can you try to do something unintentionally? Insofar as everyday English is concerned, I think that's a decent argument. But here we're talking about criminal policy. And there's nothing incoherent, as a matter of policy, about holding people liable for attempted reckless homicide when they consciously disregard risk of death. Indeed, there's at least one jurisdiction in the country that actually allows for it. As a result, one could argue the more incoherent practice is what just about every other jurisdiction in this country actually does. Bar attempt convictions when, by sheer luck, the consciously disregarded prohibited risk fails to occur. The truth of the matter is that there actually are good reasons to support this limitation on attempt liability, but I don't think they have much to do with ordinary language. Instead, they focus on the floodgates of liability. The idea is like this. In a world of reckless and negligent attempts to commit result element crimes, we could confront an expansion of criminal liability that goes beyond what society is comfortable with. To illustrate what I'm talking about, consider a minor tweak to the David-Val scenario from above. Now I want you to imagine that Val is an elementary school teacher accompanied by 20 of the cutest first graders the world's ever seen. Once again, Val jumps out of the way, and this time she also saves her entire class from David's reckless driving. In a world of attempted recklessness, David could be charged with 21 counts of attempted manslaughter, which is to say nothing of the additional counts that might be brought based on the dozens of other people David dangerously zoomed by on his way to the game. That could lead to extraordinary and some would say disproportionate liability, and could also result in all kinds of proof difficulties. So as a result, jurisdictions have basically drawn a line in the sand, which says that you can't be convicted of attempting to commit a result element crime absent an intent to cause that result. Now, this doesn't mean incredibly dangerous drivers like David get off scot-free. There are specific reckless driving and general reckless endangerment offenses which can be brought to cover such dangerous conduct. But those offenses are also often punished as misdemeanors, which are far less serious than felonies like reckless manslaughter or negligent homicide. Does that seem like justice to you? Maybe, or maybe not. Either way, that's the justification behind the third mens rea principle. And that brings us to the final point I'd like to discuss, an important implication of this principle. You'll notice that this third principle is entirely focused on result elements. It says nothing about circumstance elements. That's no accident, because the general rule for circumstance elements is that there's no special treatment or elevation necessary when attempt is charged. If a culpable mental state is sufficient for the target offense, well then it's enough for an attempt. And that's true whether we're talking about recklessness, negligence, or even no mental state at all in the case of strict liability. So that's good news for you because it simplifies your analysis. But it's not great news for criminal defendants who can be convicted of an attempt in the absence of belief, awareness, or any other mental state as to the circumstance element of a crime, provided it's not required by the target offense. To illustrate, let's return to the strict liability statutory rape offense we considered earlier. That offense prohibits, quote, purposely engaging in sexual contact with someone who is, in fact, a minor. To secure conviction for the completed version of the offense, the only thing that needs to be proven is that the person's conscious object was to engage in sexual contact with someone, and that this person was, factually speaking, a minor. Under the strict liability statute, it would be irrelevant that the accused believed the minor victim was above the age of consent, or even that a reasonable person would have believed this to be the case under the circumstances. And so that's also true when an attempt to commit statutory rape is charged. Consider, for example, the situation of Dilbert, a 40-year-old adult male who meets Viola, a minor female, with an incredibly realistic fake ID at a bar on a Monday night. The two schedule a sexual rendezvous for later the following evening at Viola's house. But as it turns out, Viola's dad lives at the house as well, and is also the local chief of police. And he catches wind of the situation after reading through his daughter's text messages. So Viola's dad ultimately has one of his officers waiting and then arrest Dilbert just as he begins climbing into Viola's bedroom. Let's assume that Dilbert has engaged in enough conduct to be convicted of attempt. Under these circumstances, does Dilbert have the state of mind necessary to support a conviction for attempted statutory rape? If you can, take a moment to reflect on this question, based on the mens rea principles we've been covering in this recording. Welcome back. The answer to the question is yes, Dilbert has a state of mind necessary to support a conviction for attempted statutory rape. First, Dilbert has the purpose to engage in the conduct constituting the offense. Had the officers not intercepted Dilbert, he would have engaged in sexual contact with Viola, who is in fact a minor. Second, Dilbert acted with the culpability required by the target offense. Here, the target offense only states one mental state requirement. The accused must purposely engage in sexual contact. That requirement is clearly met here because, as we just discussed, David's conscious object was to engage in sexual contact with Viola. By contrast, the key circumstance element in statutory rape, that the victim be a minor, is subject to strict liability for the completed offense. And so that's also true for an attempt to commit the same. Dilbert's mistake as to Viola's age, however reasonable it might have been under the circumstances, is irrelevant in a prosecution for completed statutory rape. And so it's just as irrelevant in a prosecution for attempted statutory rape. Therefore, under the facts you've been presented with, Dilbert clearly seems to have the state of mind necessary to support a conviction for attempted statutory rape. And with that, we've now reached the end of our discussion of the mens rea of an attempt. I know this is a pretty difficult material, so congratulations. But before I sign off, I do just want to briefly recap what we've covered in this recording. So we started out with a general overview of the three major general inchoate crimes: solicitation, conspiracy, and attempt. These three crimes are inchoate in the sense that they criminalize efforts towards committing a crime with the intent to do so, without regard to whether that intent was realized. These crimes are general in the sense that they apply broadly across specific offenses, but don't constitute independent offenses in their own right. This means that, for example, we don't convict people of criminal attempt. Instead, we convict people for attempting to commit specific crimes. And the same goes for general inchoate crimes of conspiracy and solicitation. These three general inchoate crimes cover different kinds of conduct: requests for solicitation, agreements for conspiracy, and tryings for attempt. Therefore, on the timeline of criminal activity, it can generally be said that solicitation liability arises first, then conspiracy liability arises second, and then finally comes attempt liability. But all three general inchoate crimes share something important in common. A very guilty mind must be proven to secure a conviction. In this recording, we focus on the three most important aspects of this guilty mind in the context of attempt prosecutions. First, attempt liability requires the purpose to engage in conduct constituting the target offense. Second, attempt liability incorporates the culpable mental state requirements governing the target offense. And third, when the target offense incorporates a result element, then attempt liability requires proof of an intent to cause the result. And that's true even if a lesser culpable mental state like recklessness or negligence is sufficient to satisfy the target offense. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of this recording. You're now ready to begin the class readings and assignments. I'll look forward to discussing all of them with you in class on Monday. In the meantime, take care of yourselves and be well.